He bought an old worn-out wallet at a flea market, never suspecting that inside was a secret that would change everything. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The morning began with a haze of golden light that slowly spread across the city's outskirts, illuminating the crooked lines of stalls and tables that made up the local flea market. It was a weekend ritual, a place where forgotten objects from another time resurfaced, waiting to be chosen by wandering eyes. The air was already thick with mingling scents: roasted chestnuts from a vendor near the entrance, the faint sweetness of cheap pastries, the musty odor of old leather and moth-eaten coats, the metallic tang of rusted tools. Voices overlapped in a constant murmur, fragments of haggling rising above the din, the laughter of children tugging at their parents' sleeves, the metallic clink of coins exchanged for trinkets. Among the crowd moved a man who had no particular reason to be there. He had woken up restless, his apartment feeling stifling, and had decided to walk without direction until his feet brought him to this bustling patch of disorder. He had visited markets before, but never with intent. He didn't collect stamps or coins. He didn't need furniture or books, yet something always drew him to the peculiar atmosphere, as though each object were whispering its story to anyone willing to listen. That thought often crossed his mind, that a flea market was less a marketplace and more a museum of private memories, scattered and stripped of owners, waiting to be reinterpreted by strangers. He drifted between tables stacked with yellowed paperbacks, chipped porcelain figurines, tangled necklaces, and vinyl records with covers bleached by the sun. One seller displayed a box filled with mismatched photographs, hundreds of smiling faces caught in decades past, strangers immortalized in black and white or faded Kodachrome. Another had an assortment of pocket watches, their glass scratched, their hands frozen at arbitrary hours. The man lingered there a moment, watching the way people picked them up, turned them in their palms, then set them down again. He imagined the ticking that once accompanied someone's days, the pocket the watch had warmed for years before it ended up here. As he walked further, he passed tools with handles worn smooth, jackets with linings unraveling, tin toys with chipped paint, and a row of heavy furniture far too large for the cramped apartments of modern life. He wasn't searching for anything, yet his eyes kept sweeping the tables, as though his subconscious knew better. Then, almost hidden beneath a scattering of dull keys and bent spoons, he noticed it. A small leather wallet. It was unimpressive to anyone else, just another piece of refuse among countless relics. The leather was dark brown, cracked to gray in places, the corners frayed, the stitching barely holding along one side. The clasp no longer closed properly, and it had clearly passed through many hands before ending up forgotten on this table. Yet, the moment his eyes fell upon it, something stirred. It wasn't beauty or rarity that drew him, but rather a peculiar sensation that the object had weight beyond its size, as though it carried a history that had been waiting patiently for someone to discover. He picked it up almost without thinking. The leather was rough beneath his fingers, dry from time. He turned it over, examined the wear, the faint outline of where a thumb had pressed against it countless times to open and close. The seller barely glanced at him, uninterested, already busy calling out to another passerby. When asked the price, the man shrugged, dismissing it with a wave, as if to say it was hardly worth anything. A coin or two exchanged hands, a transaction so small it might have been forgotten by both parties within minutes. Yet, as he slipped the wallet into his pocket, he felt the quiet thrill of having chosen something not by logic or value, but by instinct. He didn't know why, but he was certain this object had found him rather than the other way around. The noise of the market carried on around him, someone arguing over a record player, children darting between legs, the persistent cry of a vendor selling coffee. But in his mind the sound grew distant. His attention was caught, held firmly by the presence of that simple wallet resting against his side. He continued walking for a while, glancing at other stalls, but his focus was no longer on the chaos of objects spread before him. His thoughts revolved around what he had just bought, imagining what it might contain, who might have carried it, what kind of life was once shaped by its presence. He pictured men in suits pulling bills from it in crowded restaurants decades ago, or perhaps a young soldier tucking a photograph inside before leaving home. Each scenario seemed plausible, and the uncertainty only heightened the pull of curiosity. When he finally decided to leave the market, the wallet seemed heavier than it should have been, though he knew it was his imagination. The walk home was quiet, the clamor of the market receding behind him as he followed narrow streets lined with old brick buildings. He passed neighbors heading out with shopping bags, an elderly couple holding hands, a stray cat slipping into an alleyway. Life moved on with its casual rhythm, unaware of the small discovery that now sat in his pocket, carrying whispers from another time. At his apartment, he placed the wallet on the table beside his keys and coat. For a moment, he simply stared at it, uncertain if he wanted to open it right away or prolong the suspense. There was a peculiar reverence in the act, as if he were about to disturb something sacred. He imagined the years that had passed since anyone had last touched it, the silence it had endured in drawers, boxes, or forgotten trunks, until fate carried it to a market stall and finally into his hands. The object felt less like a purchase and more like an invitation. The day outside brightened further, light spilling across the floorboards of his apartment. But inside he felt as though he had stepped into a threshold. It was no longer just about idle wandering through a flea market, no longer about chance encounters with dusty relics. He had brought something into his life that carried a story he had not yet read, a story that might lead him far beyond the limits of his ordinary routine. As he sat alone in the quiet room, the faint hum of the city in the background, he thought again of that phrase he had considered so many times while wandering among other people's belongings. Every object is a fragment of a life waiting to be rediscovered. This wallet, with its cracked leather and weary stitching, was no exception. He could feel it. It had waited long enough, and now it was his turn to uncover what lay hidden within. The decision was made. He would open it, explore its contents, follow wherever it led. At that moment, he could not imagine how deeply the discovery would touch him, how it would bind him to lives he had never known, how it would stretch a thread from past to present. For now there was only the quiet anticipation, the sense of holding a secret that trembled on the verge of being revealed. And so, as the shadows shifted slowly across his room, he prepared himself for the first look inside, unaware that the simple act of purchasing a forgotten wallet at a flea market would become the beginning of a journey into memory, loss, and the fragile persistence of love. The wallet sat on the table where he had left it the moment he returned from the market, a small, unimposing thing that seemed at first glance to hold little more than the weight of its leather. Yet, even as he moved about his apartment, hanging his coat, washing his hands, pouring a glass of water, his gaze kept drifting back to it. The object carried with it an aura of unfinished business, as though its mere presence demanded attention. Eventually, he gave in to the pull, sat down before it, and placed his hands carefully on either side as if approaching something fragile. The surface was cracked and dry, the years having stripped it of its former sheen. His fingertips traced the lines and fissures like the wrinkles of an aged face, and for a moment he felt a pang of tenderness for the nameless person who had once carried it, opened it, and trusted it with tokens of their life. The faint scent of old leather rose when he lifted it closer, mingled with something else, something indefinable. Dust, perhaps, or the lingering trace of paper that had spent decades pressed against its walls. He eased it open, the clasp giving way reluctantly. Inside, the compartment sagged, the linen frayed and discolored. At first glance, there was nothing remarkable. No coins rattled within, no modern credit cards or plastic to suggest recent use. But pressed deep into the folds were several items that instantly drew his breath. He lifted them out one by one, laying them carefully on the table as though unwrapping gifts from another time. The first was a photograph. The edges were curled, the colors faded to sepia, yet the scene was clear enough. A young couple standing at what appeared to be a railway platform. Behind them blurred the vague shapes of passengers, trunks, and the steel outline of a waiting train. The man in the picture wore a uniform, the cut and insignia unmistakably military, though softened by the gentle smile on his lips. Beside him stood a woman in a pale dress, her hand clasped tightly in his, her face lifted toward him with an expression that mingled pride and sorrow. It was the look of farewell, frozen in an instant of intimacy against the bustle of departure. He held the photograph in his hands longer than necessary, studying the tilt of their heads, the way her fingers clung to his sleeve. There was a vitality in them, a youth preserved long after the decades had marched on. He imagined the anticipation, the unspoken fear, the certainty that this moment mattered, that they wanted to keep it forever. Beneath the photograph lay a folded piece of paper. The creases were brittle, and he unfolded it with care, conscious that too much haste might tear it apart. When, at last, it lay open before him, he saw the lupin handwriting stretching across lines that had yellowed with age. The ink had paled, yet the words were still legible, their rhythm immediate and personal. It was a letter written from the man in the photograph to the woman. The first words already carried a warmth, an intimacy of tone, a declaration that this was no casual note but a message of devotion. The soldier spoke of his impending departure, of the uncertainty of the days ahead, of the comfort he took in her presence. He promised to return, pleaded that she wait for him, confessed that she was the one reason he felt strong enough to leave. Each line bore the urgency of youth caught in the grip of war, a mixture of hope and fear distilled into ink. The man reading it felt as though he had been pulled into their confidence. A stranger suddenly entrusted with secrets whispered across time. He imagined the young soldier bending over a desk or table, hurried yet determined, his pen racing to capture thoughts before the train carried him away. He imagined the woman receiving it, holding it to her chest, perhaps rereading it under lamplight, hearing his voice in every stroke of the pen. As he set the letter down, he discovered the final contents of the wallet, several banknotes folded and pressed flat. The paper was thick, coarse by modern standards, the colors dull but still recognizable. They were bills issued during the years of the Second World War, their denominations and designs no longer in circulation. He recognized that collectors would pay for them, but their value was trivial compared to what they represented. These were not just scraps of currency. They were relics from a world at war, passed hand to hand at a time when every meal, every journey, every decision carried the weight of survival. He arranged the three discoveries before him: the photograph, the letter, the banknotes. Together they formed a mosaic of a life long gone, fragments that hinted at love, duty, and loss. He leaned back, absorbing the sight. A wallet bought for a coin at a market stall had yielded not refuse, but a capsule of memory, something once precious enough to guard close to the body and then, inexplicably, lost. For a long while he sat in silence, the city outside dimming into evening. He could hear the faint hum of traffic, the occasional bark of a dog, but his attention was absorbed wholly by the items before him. He felt the strange intimacy of trespassing in a story not his own, the sense that he had stumbled into a private chapter meant for two people who had long since vanished. Yet, alongside the unease, there was awe, the recognition that fate had placed in his hands an unfinished tale waiting to be heard again. He tried to imagine the arc of events. The photograph told of departure. The letter promised return. The banknotes hinted at journeys untaken or meals uneaten. What, then, had become of them? Did the soldier come back to her? Did she keep waiting, clutching the letter, until the years eroded her hope? Did the wallet slip from his pocket in a station or a barracks, or was it carefully packed away and later forgotten in a drawer? Each possibility spiraled into questions he could not answer, but all of them carried weight, pressing against him until his chest ached with curiosity. At last he gathered the items back into the wallet, sliding them gently into place. He closed it and sat with it resting in his palm, heavier now with meaning than when he had carried it home. A resolve formed within him, subtle at first but strengthening as the minutes passed. This was not a trinket to be discarded or displayed for novelty. It was an invitation to uncover, to pursue the truth hidden behind the photograph's smiles and the letter's vows. He looked once more at the wallet, its cracked surface dull under the lamplight. It had seemed so unremarkable lying forgotten on a market table, and yet it had drawn him with an insistence he now understood. It had waited, carrying voices from a time of parting and uncertainty, for someone to open it again. That someone, by chance or design, was him. When he finally rose from the table, the decision was already made. He could not simply set the wallet aside. The story it contained demanded continuation, and he felt a strange responsibility to answer that demand. Whatever had happened to the young couple, whatever history lay hidden in forgotten records and fading memories, he would follow the trail until he knew. The room had grown darker, the city outside shifting into night, but within him the path forward glowed with clarity. He had crossed a threshold. What began as idle wandering through the flea market had become something more profound, the first step into another life's unfinished tale. And as he placed the wallet carefully on the shelf beside his bed, he felt the anticipation of the next stage of the journey, when the voices of the past would begin to reveal themselves more fully, and the search for truth would lead him further than he could yet imagine. The night had passed with restless weight. He lay in bed, listening to the faint city noises that seeped through the window, distant cars, the occasional clatter of footsteps on the pavement below, the murmur of voices drifting from a late-night gathering. But his thoughts were never far from the wallet that now rested on the shelf beside him. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and brief, and every time he turned he half expected to hear the faint rustle of paper, as though the letter itself longed to be read again. By morning, when gray light spilled across the curtains, he knew he could not resist returning to it. He carried the wallet back to the table, setting it down gently as though it were made of glass. The photograph still lingered in his mind, the soldier in uniform, the woman in the pale dress, but it was the letter that drew him with the strongest pull. He unfolded it carefully once more, laying it flat so the creases did not snap. The ink, though faded, held its form well enough. The handwriting was elegant, the kind born from a time when penmanship was taught with diligence, each loop and curve practiced until it became as natural as breathing. He began to read, slowly, allowing each word to settle not only in his eyes, but within his chest. The letter opened with tenderness, addressing the woman with an intimacy that belonged only to lovers. The soldier spoke of the station from which he wrote, of the whistle of trains preparing to depart, of comrades already settled into carriages with grim determination in their eyes. Yet, his own focus never strayed from her. He wrote of how her presence the night before had given him courage, how the memory of her smile would carry him through the uncertainty of battle. His words wove a picture of a man torn between duty and love, bound to a war he could not avoid, yet desperate to cling to the one thread of certainty that made him feel alive. Line after line carried both urgency and restraint. He promised her that the separation would not be forever, that each day away would only strengthen the bond between them. He asked her to keep his photograph close, to look upon it when doubt threatened, to believe in his return as fiercely as he believed in their future together. There was a rhythm to his words, a mixture of optimism and fear that revealed itself not through what he said, but through the gaps, the hurried slant of certain sentences, the way some phrases seemed to trail off as though he had struggled to decide how much truth to reveal. The man reading it felt the letter vibrate with life, as though the soldier's hand had only just left the page. He could almost hear the sounds of that station, the clang of metal, the shouts of officers, the hiss of steam, the brief moments stolen for ink and paper before departure tore him away. He imagined the woman unfolding this same letter decades ago, pressing it to her chest, perhaps letting tears fall onto the lines, blurring the ink with salt water. The intimacy of that vision struck him deeply, and he felt both honored and intrusive, as if he had stumbled into a room where two people whispered to one another in complete trust. He read the letter again, slower this time, tracing every line as though searching for hidden meaning. One phrase caught him. The soldier had written, "I will return to you, even if the world breaks itself apart." The defiance of those words stirred him, for it was not merely reassurance but a vow made against the weight of history itself. Yet vows made on battlefields were fragile as the bodies that bore them. When he finished, he folded the letter once more, though now with a reverence that bordered on ritual. He placed it beside the photograph, arranging them as though on display, conscious that these two items belonged together, each illuminating the other. Together, they told a story incomplete, and he felt the gnawing hunger to know the rest. Who had these people been? What had happened after the photograph was taken, after the letter was read? Did the soldier return as he had sworn, or had the world indeed broken itself apart and swallowed him into silence? The banknotes remained where he had set them the night before, and he considered them too. Money from a vanished era, crisp once, now dulled by age. They were practical objects, but in the context of the wallet they became symbols. Perhaps they had been placed there for safekeeping, to buy a ticket home, to purchase a gift for the woman upon return. Or perhaps they were simply leftovers from a time that had passed, meaningless without the hands that had once used them. His thoughts circled back again and again to the letter. It was not only the words that held him, but the emotions that spilled between the lines, the subtle hesitations, the way the soldier's fear pressed against his determination, The man realized that this was no ordinary document, but a testament, a piece of the human heart preserved by accident. It demanded more than passive admiration. It demanded pursuit. The morning drifted into afternoon as he sat at the table, staring at the items, his own life forgotten. The apartment was quiet, the world outside going about its usual routines, but he was consumed by the pull of the past. Every instinct told him that what he had found was more than coincidence. Objects did not simply appear without reason, and this one had chosen him to carry it forward. The thought was irrational, yet it lodged deep in him, impossible to dismiss. He tried to imagine what course of action lay before him. He could keep the wallet as a curiosity, a relic to show friends, a conversation piece placed on a shelf. Yet that felt like betrayal. The story within deserved more than to gather dust. He could sell it too. Collectors would prize the banknotes, perhaps even the photograph. But the very idea sickened him. To reduce a life, a love, to a transaction was unthinkable. No, the only path was clear. He would find out what had happened. He would learn who the soldier was, who the woman was, and what had become of their story. The photograph, the letter, the banknotes, they were clues, threads waiting to be followed. Somewhere, records would exist. Somewhere, memories lingered. He would uncover them no matter how long it took. The resolve crystallized as the light shifted and shadows grew across the room. He gathered the items back into the wallet, not out of indifference, but as a gesture of protection. He set it down carefully, almost ceremonially, and sat in silence as evening deepened. He thought of the soldier's words again, of the promise to return even if the world shattered. That promise had become his own now, a promise to uncover the truth, to see the story through to its end. By the time the first stars pricked the night sky, he knew there was no turning back. The wallet had chosen him. The letter had spoken to him, and the past had reached across decades to demand that he listen. Tomorrow he would begin. The pursuit of answers would carry him into libraries, archives, perhaps even distant towns. The couple in the photograph had lived once, had loved once, and he would not let them remain silent shadows any longer. The letter lay at the heart of it all, a fragile slip of paper that had survived beyond expectation. It was both plea and promise, echo and vow. It had been written for one person only, yet by fate's design it now belonged also to him. And as he sat alone with that knowledge, he felt the weight of history press upon him, urging him forward into the search that awaited. The night after reading the letter was different from the one before. Where the first had been restless with curiosity, the second was haunted with determination. The words of the soldier echoed in his mind, reverberating against the silence of his small apartment. He could not allow them to remain suspended in uncertainty. Promises written in ink decades ago demanded resolution, and though he was not the woman for whom they were intended, he felt he had inherited the duty of seeing them through. By morning, his course was set. He would search for the traces left behind, fragments scattered in the archives of history. The first steps were tentative. He began with the obvious, spreading the photograph and letter across the table in the morning light, examining them for details he might have overlooked. The soldier's uniform offered hints, insignia that marked not only the country, but perhaps the division, the era. The station platform, though blurred in the background, bore signs, letters half visible that might correspond to real places. He wrote these details down in a notebook, forming a list that was both guide and riddle. With his notes in hand, he turned to the modern tools of search. Online records, military registries, digital archives all became his companions through the long hours of the day. He typed the soldier's name as it appeared in the letter's signature, pairing it with words like enlistment, regiment, casualty. At first, the results were vague, drowning him in irrelevant information, but persistence began to narrow the field. Again and again, the same name appeared in association with wartime documents, and with each appearance the contours of the man grew sharper, as though emerging from fog. He learned that the soldier had been enlisted in the early years of the war, that he had trained at a base not far from the station where the photograph might have been taken. He found records of departure dates, movements of battalions, and the faint outline of a journey that had carried him across the ocean. The more he discovered, the more real the figure became. He was no longer a smile in a photograph, no longer just a hand that had penned a love letter. He was a man of flesh and determination, pulled into the tide of history, leaving behind traces for strangers to find decades later. But along with the details came the inevitable shadow. One particular record stopped him cold. The soldier's name was listed among those reported missing in action, the column of text that stripped away certainty with a few stark words: presumed lost. The date matched the period when battles had grown fiercest, when entire units vanished into smoke and earth. He sat back, staring at the screen, feeling the breath leave him. The promise to return, written with such conviction, had met the cruel indifference of war. Still, even this did not answer everything. Missing in action was not the same as confirmed dead. Hope lingered in that ambiguity, the same hope that perhaps had kept the woman waiting. He realized that to understand her part of the story, he would need to shift his search, to follow her instead. The photograph, after all, held two figures, and the letter had been written for her eyes. Who was she? And what became of her after the soldier vanished? His investigation led him away from military records and into the quieter archives of civilian life. Census reports, old newspapers, municipal documents became the terrain he navigated. Days slipped into one another as he pored over microfilm in libraries, the smell of dust and old paper saturating his senses. He sat under the dim hum of fluorescent lights, scrolling through reels that spun before his eyes like the turning of time itself. Occasionally, an article would catch his attention, a name in the society pages, a mention of a young woman seen at a local event, but he pursued them only if they matched the few details he had gleaned from the letter. It was in the archives of a small regional paper that he finally found her. A photograph, grainy and small, showed a woman standing with other townspeople at a commemorative gathering years after the war. The caption bore her name, and though time had etched lines into her face, he recognized the same features from the earlier photograph. She had aged, but her expression carried a solemn dignity, as though she had long ago accepted a fate that remained unresolved. Digging further, he found notices, brief mentions that told fragments of her life. She had never married, never left the town where she had once stood at the station. Neighbors remembered her as quiet, reserved, often seen walking alone. One article, written late in her life, described her attendance at an annual memorial service for the missing. She was quoted only once, saying that waiting was its own kind of devotion. The words struck him like a blow, for they carried the echo of the letter he had read, as though she had lived her entire life keeping her end of the promise he had made to her. The discovery overwhelmed him. The soldier had been swallowed by war, his vow unfulfilled, but the woman had carried the burden of that vow into the twilight of her years. She had remained bound to him, even as decades passed and the world around her shifted into modernity. He could picture her each year at the station, perhaps glancing at departing trains, her mind replaying the moment captured in the photograph. The tragedy of it deepened his resolve. This story could not be left fragmented. It had to be gathered, preserved, honored. At times, he wondered why he felt so compelled. He was no historian by trade, no genealogist. Yet the objects in the wallet had chosen him, thrusting into his life a narrative that demanded completion. Perhaps it was because the soldier's promise had become his own, or because the woman's devotion stirred something within him that longed for meaning beyond his ordinary days. Whatever the reason, he could no longer imagine setting the task aside. Evenings now found him surrounded by papers, photocopies of records, clippings of old articles, notes scribbled in his hand. His apartment resembled a miniature archive, the past spilling into every corner. Yet, amid the dust and fatigue, there was exhilaration too. He was piecing together lives, giving voice to silence. The photograph no longer stood alone. It had a context, a setting, a history. The letter no longer spoke in isolation, but was part of a larger symphony of devotion and loss. Late one night, as he arranged the documents before him, he noticed how the lamplight fell upon the wallet itself. Closed now, it seemed less like an object and more like a vessel, a container of memories that had guided him to this place. He touched it lightly, acknowledging that the journey was far from over, for he had yet to connect these fragments to the present, to bridge the gap between then and now. Somewhere, he felt sure, there were still echoes of their story, perhaps in the memories of relatives, perhaps in the artifacts left behind in attics and boxes, and so he resolved that the search must go on, beyond archives and into the living traces of family and descendants. The path forward would not be easy, but it was necessary. The soldier's name had been nearly erased by time, the woman's devotion nearly forgotten. Yet, through the wallet, through the accident of a purchase at a flea market, their story had been given a chance to resurface. As dawn crept across the sky outside his window, he felt the weight of exhaustion pressing down, but he also felt a strange exhilaration. He was no longer merely reading a letter or holding a photograph. He was following the trail of two souls who had once lived and loved, and in doing so, he was preparing to bring them forward into memory once more. The search for traces of the past had only begun, but already it had changed him. He knew now that he would not stop until he had carried it to its conclusion. The weeks that followed were consumed by his discoveries, and yet the more information he gathered, the heavier the silence became. It was as though each fact about the soldier's disappearance or each article mentioning the woman's later years drew him closer to them, while at the same time reminding him of the vast emptiness that separated their lives from his. The missing details pressed upon him like shadows, and he could not help but feel he was walking through corridors lined with fragments of someone else's memory, piecing them together with reverence and sorrow. He had grown used to sitting late into the night surrounded by photocopies and clippings, the glow of the lamp casting long shapes across his table. It was during one of these evenings, when the city outside was hushed and only the faint hum of passing cars could be heard, that he finally allowed himself to linger on her story rather than his. The soldier's fate had been recorded in blunt language: missing, presumed lost. But her life had stretched on for decades after that moment at the station. He began to realize that in many ways the tragedy was not only his disappearance but her long endurance of absence. From the newspaper snippets he had uncovered, he pieced together the outline of her life. She had remained in the same town, where the photograph had been taken, her name appearing occasionally in local reports, never in a way that suggested she had remarried or moved on. There was one poignant mention in an article commemorating the anniversary of the war's end, where she had been quoted as saying that waiting had become her devotion. Those words lingered in him like a bell's toll. Waiting, she had said, as though the act itself was sacred, as though her life had been reduced to a vigil that no ending could break. He imagined her through the years, walking streets that changed slowly, their shop windows replaced, their buildings repaired or crumbling, while she remained the same solitary figure. He pictured her returning to the railway station on anniversaries, perhaps standing at the same spot where the photograph had been taken, scanning the arriving trains with an expression that blurred hope with resignation. Her devotion was a monument no less solid than stone, carved not in marble but in daily choices, to remain unmarried, to preserve the memory of a man who had sworn he would return. The more he thought of her, the more the photograph transformed. At first, it had been a portrait of two lovers, a snapshot of farewell, but now it became a symbol of her lifelong vigil. That captured moment was not just the beginning of their separation. It was the anchor she never released, the frame of memory into which she poured her days. He wondered if she had kept the letter close by, folded and unfolded until its creases wore thin, or if the wallet itself had once belonged to her after his disappearance, a relic she preserved as a proof of what once was. The mystery deepened, and with it his compassion. He began to read between the lines of her absence. The silence of records often spoke louder than their presence. There were no wedding announcements, no birth notices tied to her name, no property transactions suggesting she had moved elsewhere. Instead, the trail was of quiet constancy, the kind of life lived not for the milestones of family or career, but for the simple endurance of memory. She had not filled her days with replacements for what was lost. She had filled them with the presence of absence itself. It struck him that her faithfulness was not a passive act. To remain in one place, to never surrender to the lure of forgetting, was its own kind of strength. He wondered how many people around her had told her to move on, how many friends had drifted away, how many neighbors had pitied her. Yet she had continued, year after year, carrying her love like a lantern through corridors of time that offered no promise of return. In the end, hers was not a story of despair, but of endurance, an almost defiant refusal to let the world erase the man she had lost. The shadows of memory wrapped around him as he considered this. He thought of his own life, of how rarely he had devoted himself to anything with such constancy. He lived in a world where people discarded possessions as quickly as relationships, where even grief was expected to follow a schedule. Yet, here was a woman whose entire existence testified to another rhythm, one in which waiting itself was a form of devotion, love that had no expiration. He returned to the letter again, unfolding it and running his eyes across the familiar lines. The soldier had asked her to wait, promising his return. Those words, which might have been written as comfort for a short absence, had in her life become an eternal commandment. She had obeyed not only the letter, but its spirit, transforming her decades into an extended act of faith. Reading the words now, he saw them not only as a vow from the soldier, but as a prophecy of her life. What moved him most was the realization that her devotion had likely gone unnoticed by the wider world. In history books, her name would not appear. In records, she would be little more than a footnote. Yet, through this wallet, through the photograph and the letter, she had found a way to reach into the present, to declare that her waiting had not been in vain, because someone had finally heard her silence. He felt an almost sacred responsibility to bear witness to her story, to ensure that her life of fidelity would not vanish into obscurity. As the nights passed and his notes grew into piles, he found himself less driven by curiosity and more by reverence. He was no longer searching merely for information, but for a way to honor her. He began to think of the wallet not as his possession, but as her voice, entrusted to him so that her story might finally be heard. He imagined what she might have felt if she could see someone, decades later, caring enough to piece together the fragments she had left behind. Perhaps she had known that one day it would happen. Perhaps she had lived her life with that hidden hope. By now, the soldier's face in the photograph was still vivid, but it was hers that lingered with him longer. Her devotion had outlasted his absence. Her love had survived the silence of official reports. Her memory had carried forward without assistance until it reached him. She had become the guardian of his promise, and now he, in turn, had become the guardian of hers. As he sat with these thoughts, the room around him darkened, the city sinking into evening. The shadows seemed to swell, filling the corners, merging with the shadows of memory that filled his mind. He felt as though the walls of his apartment had thinned, and that on the other side was the station platform, the long wait, the years of vigil that stretched from her world into his. He was not alone. He was accompanied by the weight of two lives, one cut short, the other elongated by devotion. It was then that he knew with clarity what his next step must be. The time for solitary discovery was ending. If her life had been about preserving memory, then his must be about restoring it. Somewhere, surely, there were descendants, distant relatives who had forgotten or never known the depth of her story. To them, the wallet would not be a curiosity, but an inheritance, a piece of family history waiting to be restored. He could not keep it for himself any longer. The devotion of her years deserved to be carried forward by those who shared her blood. The resolution gave him a strange peace. He had walked through shadows, had listened to silence, had pieced together a vigil that had lasted a lifetime. Now he would become the bridge between past and present, returning the fragments to where they belonged. And as he placed the wallet gently back onto the table, he felt that she too was urging him onward, her devotion guiding him even now, as steady and unyielding as it had been all her life. The nights had grown quieter since he had resolved to pass the story back into the hands of family. Yet within him there remained a deep and unsteady conflict. The wallet still sat on his table, and its cracked leather darkened by lamplight, and each time he looked at it, he felt the gravity of choice pressing down. It was no longer only an object, but a vessel heavy with history and with the emotions of two lives. He knew now the arc of their story. He had walked through archives and testimonies, through silence and shadows. But the question remained what he should do with what he had uncovered. Temptation gnawed at him in moments of fatigue. He had learned through his research that the wartime banknotes he had found could command a considerable price among collectors, that the photograph, too, had value as an antique, and that even the letter, fragile and intimate, could be auctioned to someone eager for relics of human sentiment. There were entire markets for such things, markets not unlike the one where he had first stumbled upon the wallet, where bidders competed not for stories, but for possessions. To part with the items there would bring him money, perhaps enough to ease his own modest life. For hours he considered it, his mind sketching what that money might mean. Rent paid ahead of time, the possibility of travel, the luxury of ease. Yet each time the thought lingered, something inside recoiled. The idea of selling felt like a desecration. He pictured the soldier's careful words, written in haste before departure, and the woman who had folded the letter over and over as years passed without return. He imagined her waiting, year after year, clutching the photograph, carrying it as though it were a heartbeat outside her body. To strip those items from their meaning and reduce them to commodities seemed a betrayal of both her devotion and his vow to honor it. He could not imagine strangers holding them with the same reverence. Still, doubt gnawed at him. Perhaps he was being sentimental. Perhaps history was always destined to be traded, forgotten, broken into pieces scattered across shelves. Yet, when he touched the wallet and felt its weight in his palm, he knew sentiment was not weakness, but the very essence of what gave the object life. Without sentiment, it was nothing more than scraps of paper and leather. With sentiment, it was eternity preserved. Slowly, the struggle shifted. The thought of money receded, replaced by a growing urgency to return the objects to where they belonged. If she had devoted her life to memory, then those who came after her deserved to inherit it, to know what she had carried in silence. He imagined a family gathered around the table, opening the wallet for the first time in decades, seeing the photograph of their relative young and smiling, reading the words he had written before disappearing into war. Perhaps they had never known this detail of their past. Perhaps it would heal something in them, reconnecting them to roots they had not realized were there. The decision solidified, though with it came the daunting question of how. He had names from his research, fragments of family trees discovered in records and census lists. He had addresses scattered across states, some perhaps outdated, some belonging to people far removed from the woman's branch of the family. The task would not be easy, but then again, nothing in this journey had been. He resolved to follow the trail as he had followed every other, with patience, persistence, and a sense of reverence. His days took on a new rhythm. By morning, he returned to the libraries and archives, this time focusing not on the soldier or the woman, but on the branches of kinship that might extend from them. He spent hours scrolling through genealogical databases, cross-referencing names and dates, building tenuous links between generations. At night, he spread his findings across the table, tracing lines on scraps of paper, as though drawing maps through time. His apartment became a place where past and present tangled, the walls echoing with the faint murmur of names spoken aloud in the solitude of research. At times, frustration pressed heavily. Records grew thin in places, whole branches of the family tree ending abruptly or dissolving into anonymity. But then a small detail would surface, a marriage certificate, a property sale, a mention in a newspaper, and the lines would extend again, carrying him closer to the present. He began to imagine the faces of those who might still live, unaware of the story that lay waiting in his hands. The more he searched, the more the decision hardened into conviction. This was his role now, not as owner, but as messenger. He had been chosen to carry memory forward, to return what had been lost. He thought of her, the woman who had spent a lifetime waiting, and it seemed right that her devotion should not die unrecognized. By placing the wallet into the hands of her kin, he would allow her vigil to continue in another form, transformed from silence into remembrance. Even as he worked, the wallet remained nearby, a constant reminder of his purpose. Sometimes he would open it again, touch the photograph, smooth the folds of the letter, run his fingers over the brittle edges of the banknotes. Each time he did, he felt a renewed surge of responsibility. These were not his treasures to keep. They were entrusted to him only long enough for him to guide them back to where they belonged. Yet it was not only duty that moved him. There was also hope. He imagined the moment of revelation, the way the faces of distant relatives might light with recognition, or with shock, or with tears. He imagined them clutching the letter, reading it aloud, perhaps for the first time in living memory. He imagined them seeing the photograph and finding in it features that echoed their own, proof that blood and memory persisted across generations. It would be, he thought, like handing them a missing piece of themselves. As nights grew late and his work stretched on, he often found himself staring out the window at the city lights, thinking of how strange it was that a simple walk through a flea market had brought him here. He had been restless, aimless, searching for nothing in particular, and yet what he found had reshaped his days entirely. He no longer felt the same detachment from the world around him. He carried within him the weight of other lives, and that weight had given his own life a direction he had not known he lacked. When, at last, he closed his notebook one evening and looked at the stacks of papers and the wallet resting atop them, he felt the certainty settle into him like stone. He would find her relatives. He would place this history in their hands. He would honor both the soldier's vow and the woman's lifelong devotion. Money, convenience, curiosity, all of these paled beside the clarity of that decision. And so, as he prepared to set out on the next stage of his journey, he understood that the path ahead might be difficult, filled with unanswered letters, unreturned calls, fruitless searches. Yet the weight of the wallet in his pocket told him that persistence was the only answer. Just as she had waited faithfully all her life, he too would pursue faithfully until the story was complete. For in his hands rested not only an old wallet, but the memory of love itself, and that was something too sacred to abandon. The search that had begun as curiosity had grown into devotion, and finally hardened into decision, now carried him into the last stage of his journey. He had chosen not to sell, not to keep, not to bury the story in the quiet corners of his apartment. He had chosen instead to return it, to hand the fragments of history back to the family whose blood still pulsed in the present. Yet, choice was only the beginning, and what followed was a series of patient efforts, the kind that tested his resolve as much as any discovery in the archives had done. The names he had gathered, half-formed branches of family trees, began to shape into clearer lines as he pursued them through census records, public directories, and local registers. It was painstaking work, demanding hours of cross-referencing and the endurance to chase dozens of dead ends. Some names led nowhere, their traces vanishing into marriages that changed surnames or into migrations that dissolved into silence. Others carried forward, but broke apart in confusing ways, with multiple people bearing the same names, scattered across different towns and years. Yet he persisted, guided by the conviction that somewhere within those tangled lines lived someone who bore even a distant connection to the woman who had once stood at that station, waiting. At last, a path revealed itself. Through an old obituary, he learned of a niece who had lived in the same town as the woman, but who had passed away only a few years earlier. From that notice, he traced the names of children, and from them, addresses. It was not proof of direct lineage, but it was connection, and connection was enough. With trembling hands, he wrote the first of several letters, explaining as best he could the discovery he had made, the story he had pieced together, and his desire to return the wallet and its contents. He sent them off, not knowing if they would be believed, if they would be read at all. Days passed in silence, then weeks, and with each turn of the calendar he felt the familiar ache of uncertainty pressing down upon him. Then, one evening, the phone rang. The voice on the other end was cautious, tinged with curiosity, as though uncertain whether he was speaking truth. But, as he described the photograph, the letter, the wallet itself, the tone shifted. The man who spoke to him was the grandson of the woman's niece, and though the story of the soldier had become little more than a faded family tale told in fragments, recognition stirred. He confirmed details that matched the records he had gathered, recalled how his grandmother had once spoken of an aunt who never married, who had waited all her life for a soldier who never returned. The connection was real. Arrangements were made for him to visit. He carried the wallet with him on the train, feeling its weight anew as landscapes rolled past the window. It seemed almost poetic that he should travel by rail, as though echoing the journeys of those who had once stood on a platform decades earlier. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against the track filled him with anticipation and with dread. Would they accept the gift he bore? Would they see in it what he had seen, or would it strike them only as a curiosity, a reminder too distant to touch? The house was modest, a simple structure on a quiet street, and as he walked up the path he felt his heart hammer against his ribs. The door opened to reveal a family gathered not in formality but in warmth, their faces a mixture of expectation and disbelief. He introduced himself, offering no more than the truth. He had bought a wallet at a flea market, and inside it he had found a story that belonged to them. When he set the wallet on the table and gently opened it, laying out the photograph, the folded letter, the banknotes, silence fell. They leaned forward, drawn as though by instinct. One of them touched the photograph first, lifting it carefully, studying the young woman's face. Another reached for the letter, unfolding it slowly, reading aloud in a halting voice the words the soldier had written. As the lines filled the room, the atmosphere thickened. The soldier's vow, written decades before, seemed to echo against the walls, binding past and present together in an unbroken thread. Tears glistened in eyes that had never seen him, never known him, yet carried his blood all the same. They asked questions, and he answered as best he could, recounting the hours he had spent in archives, the records he had traced, the articles he had uncovered. They listened not only to the facts but to the reverence with which he spoke, recognizing that he had not merely stumbled upon their history but had carried it with devotion. The wallet, once forgotten, had become the vessel through which they reclaimed a part of themselves. As the evening wore on, he found himself stepping back, allowing them space to absorb what they had received. Laughter mingled with tears as stories were shared, fragments of memory reawakened by the photograph and the letter. They spoke of the woman they had only known as a quiet figure in family lore, her devotion half forgotten, and now revived in vivid detail. For them, the wallet was not just an artifact. It was proof of love, of sacrifice, of the resilience of memory. When, at last, he rose to leave, he felt lighter, though not because he had unburdened himself of an object. Rather, it was because he had fulfilled something larger, something sacred. The wallet no longer belonged to him, nor to the dust of forgotten markets. It belonged where it had always been destined to return, in the hands of family, in the heart of remembrance. On the train ride home, the night pressed against the window, the reflection of his face overlaying the blur of passing lights. He thought of the soldier, of the promise to return even if the world broke apart. In a way, through the devotion of the woman and through his own chance encounter, the soldier had returned. His words had reached beyond war and silence, beyond the decades, into the voices of those who now read them anew. The woman's vigil, too, had not been in vain. Her waiting had become memory, and memory had found new guardians. He leaned back in his seat, exhaustion mingling with peace. What had begun as idle wandering through a flea market had ended as an act of restoration, a bridging of time. He understood now that objects do not merely survive, they carry with them the echoes of lives waiting for someone to listen. He had listened, and he had answered. The city greeted him with a familiar noise when he stepped off the train, yet he walked through it changed. In his pocket there was no wallet, no photograph, no letter, and yet he carried them within him more deeply than before. The return of memory was complete, and with it came the quiet knowledge that sometimes the past is not gone, but waiting, patient and silent, for the right hands to bring it back to life. Don't miss the next unbelievable stories we have coming your way. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on the bell so you never miss a moment. If you loved this one, check out the other shocking videos waiting for you on our channel. And share this video with your friends. Let them be just as stunned as you are.